Hey all, welcome back to another episode of the Fractional Typology Project. My name is Tita Koshi. Today we're going to be talking about Ladybug from Bullet Train, specifically in the attitudinal psych system. So beware, there are spoilers ahead. So, first their votes. Okay. As you know, or maybe you don't know, if any of this stuff does not seem familiar to you, please go back and watch the introduction to the FTP video. Attitudinal psych is complicated enough that you probably need an introduction. So each of these, the position of these letters, says something about what they are and what they do. And you'll notice that most of these, these three types at the top, they have first F in common, F in the first position, which is first physics. Now, if we think about Ladybug as a character, do they actually fit first physics? So this is a couple of characters that are gold tier first physics in terms of the votes on the personality database. Obviously, these characters have some major differences to Ladybug, but we're talking about just their orientation towards physics. These two give a good precedent that we'll build into. So first physics versus second physics. Both of them are strong physics, which I do think Ladybug has. Now, the key difference between them is that first physics is self-positive but others negative, which leads to a self-oriented, stingy way of carrying physics due to a distrust of others. Second physics, meanwhile, is self-positive and others positive, and is ambivalent about, what happens with physics. They're confident with it, but they don't have a sort of like greed with it. Both Christoph and Richard are both stingy with their physics. They're both particular in a way that is others negative about their physics. Ladybug is not like this. Consider Ladybug's dynamic with Marie. Well, okay. So this is a compare and contrast between first physics and second emotion versus first emotion and second physics. Now, if we look back at the dynamics between Ladybug and Maria, where does Ladybug show distrust and break rank versus where does Ladybug not really care and fold in comfortably? In terms of his physics, Ladybug, I think, trusts Maria for anything and everything. Versus with his emotions, with his emotional principles, that's where he tightens up, which I think is much more indicative of first emotion, second physics, than first physics, second emotion. Now, to get in at this, we have to talk a little bit about the stereotyping of the personality database community. So, second emotion is interesting. To understand how second emotion is often voted, you need to understand the relationship that the personality database has to FI versus FE. This is, four-letter system is the most popular system. Most people who are getting into typology understand the four-letter system. Because of that, it forms a sort of implicit framing for how people greet the emotions. Introverted feeling is, a self-oriented thing, and then extroverted feeling is a thing oriented towards others. So roughly speaking, first emotion and second emotion are equated to those two things. And there is some overlap, but they need to be understood as separate concepts to the extent that for how they behave. So if a character is brooding and has clear emotional problems that they wear sort of on their sleeve, they're much more likely to be voted as first emotion. I think Arthur Fleck, the Joker, was my first emotion character for the introduction to FTP. I don't know that for certain, but they're a good example of that kind of brooding that is locked as first emotion, because it's clearly others negative. The amiable and friendly nature that Ladybug treats people with gives people the impression of second emotion. FELV, which I believe is what they got voted as first, is a very common paradigm for kind SEI adjacent characters like Ladybug to be voted with. But if we actually look at Ladybug and their orientation around emotion and physics, it's clear that his emotional principles are self-positive and others negative. He doesn't have this sort of free inherent trust with others in terms of emotion. He does have that free and fluid trust with physics and has no others negative hang-ups as far as that's concerned. To contrast, here are some second emotion characters. Marjorie Tyrell, Amy Elliott Dunn, Viktor Nikiforov, which I believe was my were they my social three in the instinctual variant video? I think they were. And the Prince. These characters are very, I would say, FE adjacent in their ability to freely exchange and interchange emotions. In the way that I was conflicted with calling Ladybug socio-FE in, the socionic system, it is the same way that these characters are like have clear overlaps to socio-FE in one way or another. And so, that is a good, reference point, because second emotion, in the same way that, without hang up, Ladybug freely exchanges physics, they, without hang up, freely exchange emotion. It's not that they have rigid emotional principles. They're like, oh, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's not in that very particular way that FI frequently is. And, I mean modern FI by that extent. And in terms of where Ladybug slots in that, Ladybug, I believe, is clearly first emotion over second emotion. And also, and it follows, second physics over first physics. Now, we have 2 slots left, third slot and the fourth slot. If we were to talk about volition, third volition is self-negative and others negative, where ambition and status are a sore spot. This is not Ladybug's issue. Ladybug aligns much closer to giving up on volition and being like, whatever. Things happen. Like, that is much closer to how Ladybug treats volition in that sense. So, then we have the questions and inconsistencies. So, firstly, and this is I like attitudinal psych. I like attitudinal psych. I think it has some interesting things to say. I think that its concepts are nice, and I think that they do add something to typological discussions. One hang-up that I do have with attitudinal psych is mutually exclusive positions. So the way that attitudinal psych is designed, every aspect, emotion, logic, physics, and volition, they all need to go in their own unique slot, and they can't overlap. And I think that this presents a problem, because sometimes I think that, characters can overlap on their traits. What if a character is second emotion and freely exchanges emotion, but also second volition and freely exchanges, role and status and responsibility? I could very much see a character that could do that, but that is not a thing that the language of attitudinal psych allows for, because if you give them second emotion, their volition must be some other position. And the closest thing would be, fourth volition, because that's another, it's a passive position, so there isn't that sort of others negative hang up about it. But at the same time, like, you miss something there, because the idea of like a second emotion, second volition activist that goes out of their way to influence public dialogue towards the betterment for all people, like that is an archetype that I'm literally just making up, but like that could feasibly exist as like a psychological sample, but the system says no, it can't, and then that causes a conflict when a sample would actually exist like that, and that sort of be a toss up. For similar reasons, I had a hard time talking about the elder from the perspective of attitudinal psych, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Um, and I think that uh, Ladybug actually worked out pretty well. I do stand behind first emotion, second physics, and fourth volition for Ladybug, but because of these mutually exclusive positions, I would actually call Ladybug 2L. Ladybug is conversational and open with logic and reasoning. It's not a thing that hangs him up. But in order to keep those other three positions, I would have to give him third logic. And I don't see logic as his most sensitive point. So I do think that's a problem with attitudinal psych as a language. Additionally, and this is pretty standard, there's a problem of additional baggage that attitudinal psych can have. Attitudinal psych and socionics are both pretty ambitious systems to me that try to do a lot of different things, and intertype compatibility is one of them. I think it's simpler to just not. Uh, can this be examined? Once I get some more data about who I would qualify as what type. Yeah, but I just think it's doing a little too much, and I have a pretty low trust that like the relational dynamics will work out as cleanly as the type dynamics would suggest. So coming back to Maria, Maria is, others negative about her physics. She's very particular about how she wants things to go. And I think that, second physics from Ladybug helps to ease that over. I also think that Maria suppresses herself emotionally, and I think that Ladybug's first emotion can sort of not only get off of the mission, but also, contrast against what she wants emotionally, but it's not enough that it creates any kind of like real hangups between them. Partially because of what I would hesitantly call Maria's 2L adaptability. I almost I think a big five makes some a lot bolder claims, but I also think that like I've seen some conflict in the idea that attitudinal psych is necessarily phenomenological, because I would also call the sun from this movie FLEV, FLEV, and I do note the differences between Maria Beetle and the sun, and how both of those like sets of positions are doing different things in order to conceptualize them with the same label, which complicates the label itself. Lemon. Lemon respects Ladybug's 1E moral principles, but does not fundamentally respect him as a person enough to see that. And has, heavy motivation to act against him. Tangerine and Ladybug are opposites in a good amount of ways, and I would say that Tangerine probably abandons emotion, that he would be fourth emotion. And so the way that they encounter emotion and principles run counter to each other. But really, Tangerine doesn't get to know Ladybug enough to make those kinds of conclusions. So, and when Tangerine tries to take Ladybug out, the 2F makes that harder. Like 2F seems to be, in terms of language, also considered as like the ability to go to bat and fight for what you believe in. That was certainly the impression I received when Chloe Price was one of my second physics examples, and I don't know, it's an interesting thing about the wording of second physics. The prince doesn't see Ladybug, so doesn't see how first emotion would complicate their plans. They just kind of shove Ladybug into the box that they already made for what should be done and all that stuff. The elder relates to him with his own 1E, sees similar moral principles and appreciates that. And the White Death considers Ladybug weak. Weak and, completely out of control of his own fate and agency, which the White Death finds detestable and hates to relate to him in any capacity. These are examples of, well, not of RLUII characters, that's a typo. These are examples of attitudinal psych characters these are gold tier examples from 4 different aspect and position combinations. So, Anna Sasaki from When Marnie Was There, the Studio Ghibli film, as well as Kylo Ren, are both brooding IXFPs. And the brooding makes it very easy to say, oh, the feelings are others negative, and therefore, that prioritization of their emotional space is a thing that they prioritize. And because of how amiable Ladybug is, I think it's harder to see. But I do think that in terms of what Ladybug sticks on and doesn't trust others with, it is his emotional principles and orientation. Meanwhile, Astrid and Korra, Astrid from How to Train Your Dragon and Korra from Legend of Korra, are both willing to, fight and go down and have no problem with that. 2 characters that are consensus, gold tier consensus as third logic are Lindsay and Perito. Now, do I think that Lindsay and Perito, do I think that they're both... See, this is the problem with third logic even as a term. If you're saying that logic is their most sensitive point and they're genuinely sensitive about it, that's one thing. If the character isn't the smartest and then you're like, oh, they're dumb, let's vote them 3L. Like, that's a different thing. I don't think there's any sound evidence that Lindsay or Perito have logic as their most sensitive piece, but I think they are ditzier characters that are going to be more likely to be voted as having weak logic and having that be a sensitive or the weakest point. So I find the term a little problematic in that sense. I think it's much better when it actually talks about like logic being a sort of insecurity that one feels rather than it being like an assessment of logical capability. And then Rue Bennett and Winnie the Pooh are both examples of characters that, don't really care about their status and ambition and are just like, whatever. Mostly prioritizing their physics. I actually think it's interesting that both of those characters are socio-SI adjacent in the same way that Ladybug is. And there might be something to the representation of that. Maybe some sort of underlying phenomenology where the two are underlyingly connected, but I think it could also be that that's a common trope in media. The sort of a lazier character that's just doing things for comfort. Is that as much of a concept in real life as much as sort of the archetype that is easier to express in fiction? And that is everything. I hope you've learned something about attitudinal psych, and I will see you in the next one.